You can start it if you want to. When do you guys have the next class?
Ma'am, 10:40 to 12:40 next one.
Okay. So, okay, let's take another minute and we'll start at 8:40 sharp.
Okay, ma'am.
Mhm.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes, Amish.
Ma'am, there is a term called ecological succession. Could you please just elaborate it?
Did you not attend that class?
No, ma'am. I just presentation से समझ नहीं आया था मेरे को. Like थोड़ा बता दो please.
तो what could you understand जो आपने presentation से पढ़ा था कल?
Ma'am, it was a bit confusing, ma'am. Like समझ नहीं आया
Okay.
मेरे को जी.
So ecological succession basically. So we are living in a world where we have so many plants. There are a lot of organisms which are already there. So how did we arrive to this place that we're living? How did we reach to this stage जहाँ पे there are so many plants which are or animals which are existing together. So ecological succession refers to the gradual changes which have occurred over geological time scale and that have eventually led to the ecosystem that we're surviving in right now. So basically there are two kinds of succession. It can be a primary kind of succession which basically led to settlement and establishment of life, establishment of plant community on earth, and it can also be secondary in nature wherein there are often events like forest fire that you have a piece of land which has a community existing on it a, in proper balance in proper harmony, and then it's disturbed, it's destroyed, and it reestablishes itself. So ecological succession matlab you succeed, gradually succeed towards obtaining a balance or a sustenance of balanced community of plants as well as the animals dependent on them. So this basically is ecological succession of how over a period of time, over several thousand years, life got established. And when we talk about establishment of life, and so basically ecological succession can be called primary if there was no earlier life form or there was no plant community on a piece of land and it started from the scratch. Okay, there was weathering of rocks with the help of microorganisms,
Yes, ma'am.
then small lichens came into existence, फिर धीरे धीरे shrubs and herbs came into existence, and then there was settlement of trees and all the animals they start settling around. And similarly it can be secondary in nature कि there was a piece of land जहाँ पे all these things were growing, and then due to some natural calamity or man-made interference it got destroyed, and then it starts re-establishing itself. So secondary succession is often faster and primary takes a lot more time because
Slower.
it
Yes, ma'am.
it begins from the scratch. So could you understand it? Baki, go through it. If you
Yes,
still do
ma'am.
not understand something, so you can ask.
Okay,
So
ma'am. Thank you,
yes,
ma'am.
welcome. So we'll start with the type of we started with what different types of ecosystems that were there. तो हमने कल पढ़ा there were
एक्चुअली में
three. Yes.
मैम प्राइमरी फास्ट होता है या सेकेंडरी?
आप बताओ कौन सा होना चाहिए?
मैम
Which one?
सेकेंडरी.
Secondary होना चाहिए
Secondary
because
होना चाहिए.
yeah, because primary is starting from the scratch. It is mobilizing everything. So secondary is faster. Primary takes a really long time to occur. So we'll start again with the type of ecosystems that were there. So we started with terrestrial ecosystems. We basically covered what different types of forest ecosystems are there. They can be coniferous or broadleaf type, and broadleaf type is further divided into several types. And there are certain examples, especially the Indian references that you need to know when we talk about when if you're asked to write about these ecosystems. Then another type of ecosystem or the second major type of ecosystem which is there is the grassland ecosystem. So grassland ecosystem, as the name suggests, it includes a wide variety of grasses. So in case of forest ecosystem, the dominant organisms were trees primarily, and but in case of grassland ecosystem, there's often presence of the predominant vegetation that is there. It is often in the form of grasses, and these grasses are the primary organisms with or some small annual plants which flourish in these particular places. So grasslands have been given different names in different continents. It has been given different synonyms in different areas. So you would often hear terms like there are terms like prairies, which is the name it's given to it in Midwest and US. Then there are names like pampas and steppes. So they've been called different names in different places. But grassland, as the term suggests, it refers to the presence of. It refers to basically when the primary vegetation in a particular area is in the form of grasses or some small annual plants. So trees are not the primary form of vegetation here. Similarly, if compared to the forest ecosystem, they have a lesser requirement and they obtain lesser rainfall compared to the forest ecosystem. And since they sustain a life form which is much more simpler and is not as complex or diverse as in case of the forest ecosystem, it also indicates the quality of soil which is there. So the quality of soil in forest ecosystem is nutritionally better. It's nutritionally higher and they have higher depth because such dense roots or mangrove trees or big trees are there which help increase or regulate the depth of soil and increase the nutritional quality. On the other hand, grassland ecosystems have relatively poor nutritional quality and the depth of soil is also not as intense as that in your forest ecosystems. So these specific type of ecosystems, grassland type of ecosystems. So what do you think? Which kind of organisms should primarily be there in such ecosystems where you have so much grasses present? Which is the
Herbivores.
Yeah, which so herbivores or grazers are the primary consumers which are present there, and of course there are secondary consumers like cheetahs as well. But the primary consumers that are present there is often in the form of cattle. So a lot of human beings, a lot of human habitation is starting to interfere with these ecosystems. They're starting to inhabitate themselves in these ecosystems because they offer good food for the cattle or good food for the cattle that they are sustaining. So often a lot of herbivore organisms they survive there, especially grazers, especially the ones which feed on these grasses. So the vegetation is often in the form of grasses on their herbivorous organisms, and the animals that are there may be primary or consumers like herbivores, and animals like secondary consumers or top predators like cheetah may also are of course also present in these ecosystems to sustain the whole cycle that is there. So these grasslands are often warm throughout the year. They have a dry season, they have a rainy season also, but mostly they are dry throughout the year. They have animals like giraffe, there are zebras, rhinos, lions, hyenas, which are elephants, which are there in these grasslands. So the grasslands which are primarily warm throughout the year are known as tropical grasslands, and it's often the tropical grasslands which have higher population of giraffe or zebras, hyenas, and elephants, and they're often found in the Africa region of the world. Similarly, there are also grasslands called temperate. I'm not sure if I've mentioned it here. Anyway, we'll see. So you can write it down if you want to. And there are also grasslands which are temperate in nature. They receive lesser rainfall compared to tropical regions. The grasses are also shorter in size, they are smaller in size because the amount of rainfall that they receive is also less. So usually the only difference between tropical and temperate grassland is in of course the climatic conditions. The amount of rainfall received is higher in tropical grasslands and they are warmer in nature. And similarly, the type of grasses that flourish are better, they are sturdier and longer in case of tropical grasslands compared to the temperate grasslands. So these also have, so similarly, grasslands also have a dry season. They also have a rainy season, but the rainfall that it receives is lesser compared to the tropical grasslands. So these are, and they often face a little ha colder or cooler conditions compared to the tropical ones. So there are some grasslands in India as well. So can you name or give an example of grasslands that are there in India? Or if you've heard, have you heard of Nilgiri ranges?
Yes, ma'am.
So there is a Shola grassland, one of the most famous grasslands of India. So Shola grasslands are one of the primary pitches of grasses which are found near the Nilgiri and ranges and Western Ghats, and they are the primary example of the grasslands that are there in India. Then similarly near the Himalayan region where the temperature is a little cooler, where it's not as warm as compared to the Nilgiri ranges. So there are another range of grassland which is there, which is called Terai, Terai. So it's another temperate grassland which is found in India, which is found on the foothills of Himalayan region. So it this type of grassland is really is temperate in nature, while the one which is found near the Nilgiri ranges in the Western Ghats, Shola grasslands are relatively tropical in nature. So these are the primary two examples of grasslands that are there in India. So grasslands can also be categorized into different types. They can also be divided into different types, and there are three primary types of grasslands that are there. So you must have heard of terms like meadows or savannas or steppes. So there are different kinds of grasslands depending upon the climatic conditions, depending upon whether they are their habitat, whether it's dry or whether it's cold. So basically, meadows are those the first kind of grassland, which is meadows. They are the naturally occurring grasslands which offer extremely limited human interference. So they are rich in grasses, they are rich in herb, and they offer, since they often occur with some sort of human interference which may or may not be limited, but it's primarily not extremely high human interference. So these meadows can be used for providing shelter to cattle as well, and they're extremely important because they offer, so grasses primarily and herbs, they offer good source for pollination to occur. So they're good for the ecosystem because they offer a huge base for pollination to occur. And also once the pollination has taken course, then the same grasses can be used to provide shelter or fodder to the cattle which is there. So meadows are naturally occurring, but there is a limited human interference also, and that is why they're often called as the semi-natural grasslands as well. Then there are grasslands called, which are the second type of grasslands are steppe. So steppe grasslands are often they're away from certain lakes and rivers, and they're relatively drier compared to the meadows. So they have a dry habitat, but it's not too dry. So often the grasslands of Europe, they are the ones which come under steppe grasslands. And the third category is savanna grasslands. So savanna grasslands are a mixed type of grassland. They have grasses also, and they have some trees which are also growing in the area. So often savanna is also the area. So we have forests जहाँ पे the main population is your trees, and then we have grasslands जहाँ पे the major population or the major plant community is your grasses. So when we move from a forest to a grassland, the transition zone in between is another savanna grassland. So this is how a savanna grassland looks like. It has grasses and it also has a tree community because we're moving from a forest towards the we're converting from a forest, we're changing from a forest towards a grassland system. So it has a mixed population of both grass community as well as the tree community as well. Steppe, on the other hand, is semi-arid. It's drier. It has a drier habitat, so it has grasses which are capable of existing in drier conditions and a little temperate conditions as well. Meadows, on the other hand, they are capable of surviving in they're capable of facing a variety of climatic conditions. They can exist in tropical conditions and a little cooler conditions as well. And as I said, since it grows grasses along with herbs, so it offers a huge base for pollination to occur, and also the produce can be utilized for things like providing shelter as well as for fodder, as well as the fodder for cattle as well. So there are three major types of grasslands that are there, and these are the three grasslands. Apart from that, अगर हम इंडिया की बात करें तो there are some examples which include the Himalayan belt, which is and so the grasslands which are found at the bases of the Himalayan region. They are basically the Terai patches. They're an example of grassland. Similarly, another type of grassland can be found near the foothills of Western Ghats and Nilgiri ranges, which is your Shola grasslands. So grasslands, they of course, much like other types of ecosystem, they also face some some threat from human interferences or human activities. So what do you think are the threats to the grasslands that are there? What could be the possible threats to grassland ecosystem?
Overgrazing,
Very good. Overgrazing. And
overexploitation.
very good. So I've cited all. I thought I hadn't cited the examples. So there are a couple of examples you can refer for the Indian examples from here. So talking about the threat to grassland ecosystem, like I think Sharon just said, overutilization of grazing land or overgrazing is one of the primary problems that grasslands face, because since they provide such good amount of grasses or fodder for the cattle, so often people who are they often end up interfering with the ecosystem. They often end up crossing the boundaries, and the cattle, it overgrazes the whole system. So when of course the herbivores, they'll start overgrazing, then the primary producers will be reduced from the ecosystem, and the population of these primary consumers will also increase. So the ecosystem is being lost because of domestication, because of overgrazing. And also some farmers are converting these grasslands, these pieces of lands, into their farmland as well. So increasing agricultural growth, or invading agricultural, is one problem which is there in the forest ecosystem also. और यहाँ पर भी है कि there are farmers who, of course, they have to sustain themselves, and there's not enough land for them to grow their crops or to sustain their cattle. So they're converting these pieces of grasslands into irrigated farmlands. So, and one of the consequences of overutilization or domestication by human beings, or removal of these grasses because of overgrazing, is that cheetah has become extinct in India, and organisms like buckbeak are poached for meat. So these grasses, they're not only there for to provide, what do you say, uh, food for the herbivores. These grasses, they also provide shelter, or they also provide a place for hiding of these organisms. So when they are cut, when they are removed, it exposes the wild animals that are present there. It takes away from them the home that is there. So what do you think will happen if grasslands, they go extinct, or if grasslands are removed, or they are lost?
The whole food chain and food well will get disturbed as the producers will die because of less primary producers like plants, and because of that primary consumers, the secondary consumers that are carnivores will also die. So the whole food chain will be disturbed like that.
Yes, the food web, to be specific, will be disturbed, because if grasslands, they go exist, then so grasslands, as I said, can not only are, yes, of course, they form a major source of ecosystem, because grasses provide food to the herbivorous plants. They provide food to the grazers. So yes, the food web and the chain will be affected. Similarly, these grasses and these herbs are also a huge source of pollination. They form a huge base for the pollinators that are there. So if they are lost, the rate of pollination will also be affected, and of course other communities, and like bee community or the herbivore community, they'll also be affected. So this is why grasslands are important. They are essential. So they are, of course, important economically also, because we need to sustain the cattle. People require these grasslands for their personal fulfillment also, but they have to be utilized in balance, and do not have to be overexploited. So how to conserve these grasslands? So to conserve grasslands, one has to limit the extent of grazing, and it should be assured that a limited part or specific parts of the grasslands should be closed for grazers. So not every part should be accessible to the farmers or the grazers or the cattle holders. So the grasslands are becoming extinct. They are facing so much threat, because every portion of of this ecosystem is openly available for people to interfere, for people to come and poach animals, or for farmers to come and introduce their grazing cattle there, or for even farmers to convert these grasslands into farmland. So there have to be proper rules to limit grazing, and specific parts of the forest of grassland ecosystems, they have to be closed for grazers every year, because even if the cattle is there, they require these grasses for surviving. It's the part of the food chain, so they'll definitely require to obtain food, but specific parts should be closed every at specific time of every year, so that the grasses can regrow themselves, they can re-establish themselves. And this is the reason why a lot of sanctuaries and natural parks are being made over these grasslands, because forests are, of course, they're important because they offer huge species richness. They protect endemic species, but grasslands have long been ignored, and there are now they used to be long being be ignored, but there are a lot of sanctuaries and natural parks that are there, which are specifically for for conservation of grasslands only. So they ensure that in addition to the forest, the grasslands are also conserved, so that the animals, the wildlife which is living there also is offered a proper protection because of human interferences. So do you think there's some other disadvantage or interference because of interference to these grasslands? No, I think that is that. Another type of interference and indirect interference is also that they also utilize this the grasses. They are used for uh, they basically are the demand for products or the dried twigs for making huts or for burn for basically producing energy, they are increasing. So people are overgrazing and they're over collecting the products or grasses, the dried grasses, for their personal usage. So these are the threats and the consequences of how grasslands are affected. And one of the ways to protect them is by establishment of sanctuaries, natural parks, and by also limiting grazing to specific areas and specific time of the year. Then another major type of terrestrial ecosystem is your desert ecosystem. So desert ecosystems are areas. So we had forest ecosystems, which of course have been categorized into different categories, but they did receive some ample amount of rainfall, and they also support huge amount of species, a variety of species, endemic organisms. So they have a huge green phase with them. Similarly, grasslands, they support primarily grasses and some of the herbs, and they can also be of different types depending upon where they exist, what is the temperature conditions, and what different types of plants they sustain. The third type of ecosystem, primary major terrestrial ecosystem, is your desert ecosystem. So desert ecosystems are the ones which receive very less and extremely less rainfall compared to the other areas. So in India, there are desert and there are semi-arid regions found majorly in the western part and the Deccan Plateau. So the climatic conditions in these vast areas are extremely dry. Then another major example is the Thar Desert of Rajasthan, which is a typical desert which has also a lot of sand dunes there. Along with so in addition, so basically these areas which have such dry conditions, they do not require high amounts of rainfall. So the primary plants that it manages to sustain, or the flora population plant community it manages to sustain, are some shrubs. So shrubs are woody plants. Herbs होती हैं which are green in nature. They are smaller, they are tender, and they produce they basically have a green stem. Shrubs, on the other hand, are the ones which are more woody in nature, and they have a woody stem. So it supports shrubs. It also supports the plants which are capable of growing in dry conditions. So one of the major examples of the vegetation which grows in desert ecosystem is there is jowar, bajra. Then there are trees like babool and khair which grow in these areas, and they require very less amount of water. And similarly, the animals that are there are the camels, they are goats which are capable of storing water within themselves, so that they survive conditions, even those conditions happen, availability of water is not very high. So desert ecosystem is a very specialized ecosystem. It's also sensitive because it there is scarcity of water. The rainfall available is also very low. It's not really high. And so in addition to the Thar desert that is there, or in addition to the hot desert that is there in India, the desert can also be cold in nature. There are deserts which are hot deserts, and there are ones which are cold deserts. So, can you think of an example of a cold desert?
Ladakh, Ladakh.
Very,
Ladakh.
very good. So, cold desert is found in Ladakh, and it is situated at the higher plateau of Himalaya. And in addition to that, there are also in other pieces of desert ecosystem in India. I think you must have heard of Run of Kutch in Gujarat. So it's another semi-arid type of desert ecosystem. So the three major desert ecosystems in India are these, and of these three, the cold desert is the Ladakh region, is found near the Ladakh region of the higher plateaus of Himalaya. So the organisms found here are primarily thorny shrubby trees like cactus and jawar bajra, which do not require high water or huge amount of water to grow. And the animals that are there are like camel and goat. So along with these organisms that are there, wild ass is another example of the faunal population that is found in the desert ecosystem, especially in Run of Kutch of Gujarat. So this ecosystem is a home to a lot of rare animals also, which may not be found anywhere else. So there are birds like the great Indian bustard, which is also found in the desert ecosystem of India. So there are certain threats to the desert ecosystems also, and the threats include excessive human interferences. So these are the areas where there is less water availability, and irrigation practices are introduced externally, artificially, to ensure that different types of plants can grow in the area. So if artificially irrigation practices are over exploited, if you introduce a lot of water in the area, which is where the soil, where the plant community, it can manage well without water being available in abundance. It can affect the quality of soil that is there, and it can also immobilize the salts which are there in the type of soil available in this ecosystem. So often over irrigation or excessive artificial introduction of water can make the land unproductive for the native plants which are growing there, because these native plants, they have adapted themselves to lower availability of water. It can they have made, and also when you introduce these irrigation practices, when you carry out these irrigation practices, so you're pulling water from the groundwater tables or the underground water, the submersible which is there in our home. So basically using groundwater, you're pulling water from below the surface of earth, and these are the ecosystems जहाँ पे पानी already बहुत कम है. There is not very high availability of water in these areas. So when you pull groundwaters, it further lowers the water table. So water table is the amount of water which is there below the surface of earth, which is really low in case of desert ecosystem. So when you pull out the thoda bahut remaining water from there also, so it creates even drier conditions. And even though these organisms are capable of surviving uh, with low water availability or in drier conditions, but if you remove all the sources of water, so अगर मैं जो थोड़ा बहुत water available भी है, if I remove that also, then it makes the air conditions more saline, it makes them more harsh, and not every, and of course some plants, they may even adapt themselves, they may acclimate themselves, but the quality of plant, it declines, and then it becomes difficult for organisms to survive when conditions become drier than they're supposed to. So it creates a disbalance within the plant and the animal habitat. So one of the primary threats to desert ecosystem is that there is interference from human beings, and primarily in the form of irrigation practices. So even excessive introduction of water can be harmful, and even if you're introducing water, one of the primary sources of irrigating your lands or the areas is by obtaining water or pulling out water from the underground water resources. And when you do that, you reduce the water table further lower, and it creates even drier conditions for the organisms surviving there. So this, I think, is all about the desert ecosystem. Then we come to the final terrestrial ecosystem that is there, which is the tundra ecosystem. So what is tundra ecosystem? Have you ever heard anything about it?
Just heard.
Okay, what do you know? चलो we'll start with tundra ecosystem. So tundra, अब हमने बहुत सारे ecosystems पढ़े. We read about the areas जहाँ पे there are warmer conditions, tropical conditions. Then there are like the evergreen forest. Then there are temperate conditions also like in the deciduous forest. There are saline conditions like in mangrove forest. Then we have moderate conditions. We have conditions, moderate conditions as in case of grasslands, which sustain an altogether different type of plant community. Then we have extremely harsh, dry conditions, unavailability of water as in case of desert ecosystem. And we also have another specific kind of ecosystem, which is the tundra ecosystem. So tundra ecosystems, it refers to the type of ecosystem which is covered with snow. So often these areas are covered with snow for most of the part of the year, or for a huge major part of the year. So often tundra ecosystem can be divided into Arctic and alpine tundra, both of which face very extreme harsh winters. They face extreme cold conditions. So comparing the Arctic as well as the alpine tundras, the winters in Arctic tundras they are much more longer. They are severe compared to the Arctic tundra, while the precipitation or the amount of rainfall is also lower. It's lower in both these areas. So both these ecosystems, be it Arctic or alpine, they experience low rain amounts of rainfall, and since they experience low amount of rainfall coupled with such harsh conditions and snow almost throughout the year, the species richness is also very low. So the highest species richness was there in the evergreen forest, which had extremely high variety of organisms, while the tundra ecosystem, it faces the lowest uh, species richness. So the plants which are there, they often may be mosses. So has anybody ever been to a hill station? कोई तो गया होगा to some any hill station. So when has anybody ever been to a hill station? Okay. So I am supposing nobody has ever been there, but if anybody has ever been there, so जब हम road से जाते हैं, तो often on the mountain surfaces or the rocky surfaces, ऐसे green बहुत सारी growth होती है. When you go up a mountain, or you go up the altitude, and you're traveling in your cars maybe. So on the surface there is a huge green outgrowth. There are small organisms which are growing, so they are often mosses. So mosses are small green organisms, or bryophytes are small green organisms which are often found in colder conditions. So tundra ecosystem, they have high amounts of mosses and lichens, as we've studied. So lichens are often found in areas so they are often capable of surviving in those conditions पहला जहाँ पे pollution नहीं है. So these ecosystems are far away from polluting substances, and therefore lichens can sustain themselves there. And also there are rocky areas which offer a perfect substrate for organisms like mosses as well as lichens to grow. Then they also have sedges and grasses. So sedges are also like grasses. There are a lot more woody compared to grasses. And then there are birch trees also. So birch trees, they look something like these. So these are tiny. And they're often dwarf birch trees. They are small sized birch trees which may be found there. And the animal population that may be there, it can be in the form of foxes, polar bears, owls, lemmings, or wolves. So this is the floral and the faunal population that may be found in these areas. So similarly, in case of tundra, or the Arctic tundra is the one which is found in the northern altitude, where snow, it keeps on melting seasonally, while the alpine tundra is found at higher elevation compared to your Arctic tundra. So it winters and but winters in Arctic are longer, they are much more severe, and the summer period is shorter in case of your Arctic tundra. So precipitation is of course low in both these types of tundra, but they have certain small differences as well. So if we had to compare both Arctic and Antarctic, or the alpine tundra, so both of them are they have some common points also, like presence of ice or snow. There are icebergs present. The light availability is lower. The nights are longer, while the days they become shorter. So they have some common features also, and they have some differences also. So tundra ecosystem is primarily found in the Arctic region. Tundra ecosystem is not found in the Antarctic region. So tundra can be Arctic or it can be alpine. So there are two major kinds of tundra which are there. It can be alpine in nature, or it can be primarily Arctic, which is present near the polar regions and is much more harsher compared to the alpine tundras. So, what do you think are the threats to these ecosystems, according to you? What threats do tundra ecosystem face? And are there some Indian examples, if you can name a few?
Global warming.
Very good. Global warming.
Industrialization and air pollution also, because people are visiting that ecosystem.
Okay, industrialization, ठीक है. Industrialization in which form? Can you think of an example? Maybe. ठीक है. So what? And can you name a couple of Indian examples of Kundra ecosystem? Okay. So the threats to tundra ecosystem are, yes, climate change. There is global warming, melting of snow is happening. Then as the snow is melting, as the temperature is becoming warmer, so the tundra vegetation, it is being replaced by the coniferous trees like pines or deodar trees. So its vegetation is getting replaced. So and this is because of the warmer climatic conditions which is happening because of the human interferences. Then often oil and natural gas exploration is also done here. A lot of scientific interferences. So these areas, I'm not sure if you would have heard. I think Sharon would have. I'm not sure if Sharon, have you heard about TAC polymerase?
Yes,
In
ma'am.
yeah. So what is TAC polymerase?
तो the translation में पढ़ा था शायद से सुना था.
ट्रांसलेशन में पढ़ा था. सो बेसिकली जो टुंड्रा इकोसिस्टम होता है या फिर तो दे हैव समथिंग कॉल्ड एज हॉट स्प्रिंग्स. सो इवन दो दे वे कोल्ड एरियाज, तो यहाँ पर देर आर सर्टेन स्प्रिंग्स विच आर वेरी हॉट. दे हैव एक्सट्रीमली हाई टेम्परेचर एज हाई एज 80-90 degrees, which are fresh water streams. So and there are some organisms which are capable of surviving in very cold conditions. So mostly there are microorganisms. As I said, ki lichens and mosses live there. So a lot of microorganisms, they also live in these harsh conditions. So the organisms which are, and such small organisms which are capable of living in these harsh conditions, so unki of course enzymatic machinery is much more stronger, it's much more sturdy, and is capable enough of handling harsh conditions. So often enzymes from these organisms, they are extracted by researchers. These organisms are studied by scientists and researchers to further benefit industries. So you must have heard about oil spills, wherein I think everybody must have heard about oil spills. Things like oil spills, there is spilling of oil over the seas. So often microorganisms like pseudomonas are used because these organisms have enzymes which are so strong because they handle such harsh conditions that they can remove pollutants, or they can help human beings purify water and carry out a lot of processes that otherwise would not have been possible. So, uh, and along with natural gas exploration, so because of certain benefits or certain organisms or certain resources that are primarily available in these ecosystems, they're often affected because of human interference. And tourist interference is also there, and military is present in these areas, which sometimes hampers with the ecosystem or with the natural flora and fauna in that area. So I asked if there were some Indian examples. So tundra ecosystem is not found on the Indian subcontinent, and there are no Indian examples for tundra ecosystem. Now you must think of ki there are polar regions also, there are tundra regions also. So they are, both of them are different, because polar regions are a part of the tundra ecosystem, while tundra ecosystem is the bigger platform. So often polar region is the specific polar uh, component of the earth, while the end component, or the uh, I would say a specific pole component of the earth, while tundra region is like a biome, it's like an ecosystem that has cold temperature and lower tree population. In polar regions, there is no tree or plant population, while in the tundra regions, which are ecosystem, there is a little plantation as well as a presence of organisms as well, animal organisms as well. Then human activity is mostly absent from the polar region, while in case of tundra regions, there is human interference, there is human activity also. And the polar regions are mostly frozen, while in case of tundra regions, we have something called as permafrost. So permafrost is when you have soil and snow present together. And so basically frozen soil is what we know as permafrost. So there is presence of snow and presence of soil together, and that is it's permanently it's a frozen layer which may be present on the top or under the surface of earth. It usually is below the surface of earth, or some, and is known as permafrost. So with this we end the terrestrial ecosystem. I hope it's clear to everybody.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am,
ma'am.
but the packed polymerase का मैं समझ नहीं आया वो उसमें क्या एग्जांपल यूज किया
Tag polymerase,
मेथड
right. So basically tag polymerase is also it's an enzyme जो बहुत सारी इंडस्ट्रीज यूज करती हैं. तो जैसे अभी आरटीपीसीआर सबने सुना होगा ना, कोरोना कोविड जो केसेस हो रहे हैं और आरटीपीसीआर कर रहे हैं हम.
You tested
तो
something.
हैव यू एवर वंडर्ड कि आरटीपीसीआर होता कैसे है? तो बेसिकली हम जब आरटीपीसीआर करते हैं, द टेक्निक जिससे हमें पता चलता है कि वी आर कोविड पॉजिटिव और नॉट, देन दैट इट इज वन एप्लीकेशन ऑफ फाइंडिंग आउट कि मतलब इफ अ वायरस इज देयर और नॉट. सो उस जो आरटीपीसीआर का जो पीसीआर पॉलीमरेज चेन रिएक्शन, एंड
यस
आरटीपीसीआर इज रिवर्स ट्रांसक्रिप्टेज पॉलीमरेज चेन रिएक्शन. तो इसमें the process of PCR, it involves three steps, which and these three steps they occur at different temperatures. And there's the primary step which is there for carrying out
डीनेचरेशन
PCR. It occurs at
Actually,
75
ma'am,
to 90
uh,
degrees. So
यस
yes, somebody was saying something. Anyway, so the primary step which occurs here is at very high temperatures in between
excuse
75
me,
to
ma'am.
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but someone is liking me and removing me from the meeting. So could you please make them attendees?
Oh,
Because someone
sorry.
is liking me. I don't know who is liking me, but someone is liking me.
एक minute. I did not change it today. रुको. Give me a second. Please don't do such things वैसे. It's really childish. एक second दो. My laptop is hanging. Is the student still there? रुको.
यस
Mhm. This will take a while. Anyway, I'll continue. So as I was saying कि RT-PCR में और PCR in general में there's a step which occurs at really high temperatures at between 75 to 90 degrees. So for that use an enzyme which is Stack polymerase, and the Stack polymerase enzyme is obtained from an organism called Thermus aquaticus,
थर्मस
and hence
एक्वाटिकस
the name TAQ. मतलब T comes from thermus, AQ comes from aquaticus. So this Thermus aquaticus it survive. It is a thermophilic organism. बहुत warm conditions में it survives, and it's capable of performing even at very harsh, warm, and what do you say, very high temperatures. And so this enzyme Taq polymerase is extracted from Thermus aquaticus, and that is used in RT-PCR. So that is why I mentioned Taq polymerase. These areas, these very warm or very cold areas or extreme ecosystems are often. बहुत सारे बच्चे what removed रुको. Mm. Give me a second, I'll quickly do it. So could you understand how it functioned?
यस मैम, बट उसका मतलब टुंड्रा में क्या बेनिफिट है ये पूछ रहा था, मतलब उसमें क्या
टुंड्रा
यूज
में क्या
होता है?
बेनिफिट है, मैं बता रही थी ना कि जैसे हॉट स्प्रिंग्स जो होते हैं दे आर ऑफन फाउंड इन टुंड्रा रीजन्स, तो इवन दो दे आर कोल्ड कंडीशंस बट सिंस दे सो आई एम नॉट श्योर, हॉट स्प्रिंग्स के बारे में सुना होगा ना इन
यस मैम।
कि देर आर सम स्प्रिंग्स जहाँ से इवन दो देर आर हाई टेम्परेचर्स बहुत गर्म पानी आता है, सो दे आर
यस
वेरी and it's almost ऐसे boiling water. So in those hot springs, these organisms like Thermus aquaticus are there. So often scientists, often researchers, often industrialists, they interfere, they go to these areas और वहां से they collect these organisms. And when they do so, they disturb the ecosystem and they also disturb the surroundings that are there. And this is one threat to the ecosystem when people, of course, it is benefiting us a lot. These organisms, the research, the science is benefiting us definitely, but it has some harmful consequences in the form ki when it is done, it affects, what do you say? It affects the ecosystem of the particular area. So could you understand how it is how uh, the effort to obtain those organisms and further work upon them, it affects or it causes a threat to the natural ecosystem.
यस मैम।
ठीक है. Okay. I think it's done.
यस
अब प्लीज म्यूट मत कर, ऐसे भी म्यूट मत करना एक दूसरे को. Anyway, so with this we finish the terrestrial ecosystem. We'll start with aquatic ecosystem and what different types of. अब मेरा लैपटॉप हैंग हो गया. Give me 2 minutes. Let it. So what do you know about what types of aquatic ecosystems do you think are there? And what is aquatic ecosystem?
फ्रेश वाटर इकोसिस्टम।
Okay, there is freshwater ecosystem. Are there some other kinds of ecosystem?
यस मैम,
Marine.
मरीन एज वेल, ओशन इकोसिस्टम आल्सो।
Mm-hmm. And estuaries as well,
हाँ यस।
which so aquatic ecosystems are the areas where the abiotic component is water. You have there is the chief component in these particular areas is water. So they can be freshwater ecosystems, there can be marine ecosystems, there can be एक second, my laptop is hanged really badly. रुको. So we study different types of ecosystem, and one primary way of dividing these ecosystem is of course based on what type of water is there. So it can be freshwater, and hence it has been categorized into freshwater ecosystem which have a fresh source of water, and it can also be marine ecosystem जहाँ पे there is the water is salty. So when I say freshwater ecosystem, तो it does not mean कि उसका pH एकदम 7 है और उसमें कोई nutrients या components नहीं है. It simply means that the concentration of salt is optimal, and because it's optimal, it is fit for consumption. It does not have to undergo several layers of purification to become fit for consumption. So similarly, marine ecosystem or marine bodies like brackish water, saline water, the concentration of salt component is so high that it cannot. It of course organisms are there, different types of organisms they survive there, which have adapted themselves to such ecosystems, but for consumption by humans it has to undergo a lot of purification. Then there's still not ample methods which basically define to us कि हम कैसे marine water को purify करें to obtain drinkable water. But marine ecosystem is extremely important for the ecosystem because it offers one extremely large pool of water, the largest pool of water source. Apart from that, it is the store of all minerals, mineral components, salts which are there. It is also one of the biggest sources of, or one of the biggest natural sources of nuclear elements like uranium. So under the surface of these marine ecosystems or oceans, there are presence of trace uranium ions also, and these traits, and it is one of the most natural sources of obtaining uranium from the oceanic systems. And they are of course a part of the water cycle. They sustain the water cycle primarily, and they also support a huge set of organisms, both flora as well as fauna. So we'll be starting. So further, the freshwater ecosystem can be divided into lentic ecosystem and lotic ecosystem, and they've been categorized as lentic and lotic based upon the fact whether the water is moving or if it is stagnant. So lentic ecosystems, they're often the types of water bodies which are stagnant, which are still, and which are not flowing basically. So they are motionless. They are sitting at a place. The water is not flowing from one point to another. The water body is stagnant in nature. It's motionless in nature. So such freshwater ecosystems are called lentic ecosystems. And the examples are ponds or lakes. Similarly, the freshwater ecosystems can also be lotic or flowing. They can be in motion or they can be flowing from one point to another. And the examples are rivers and streams. So both of them are freshwater ecosystems, but they've been categorized into lentic and lotic based upon the fact that the source of water or the water body, if it's whether it's flowing or if it's stagnant. And they have both phytic and abiotic factors, and different factors affect the organisms which are growing there. How well do they grow? So we'll be starting with the lentic ecosystem, whose one of the major example is a pond ecosystem. So pond ecosystem is extremely important. It serves as a good example of freshwater ecosystem because it's self-sufficient. It's a stable, small. So what do you think is the difference between a pond and a lake? And somebody think of something. Ponds are small, lakes are big. That's the only difference. So lakes are
Yes.
the bigger bodies, ponds are the smaller bodies. And of course, there are some ponds which are very big also, but relatively speaking, your ponds are smaller in size while lakes are bigger in size. And in case of low-tech or flowing river bodies, we have rivers as well as streams. So we'll start with the pond. So pond ecosystem is important because it's very simple, it's self-sufficient, it's self-regulating, and even though it's a it can be very small also, but even then it's capable of sustaining itself. It's capable of providing for itself and the organisms that are surviving there. Pond ecosystem can be natural also, it can be artificial also. So they are a type of ecosystem which even you can make. You can dig up a hole, you can introduce some organisms, some fishes, and you can also set up a pond ecosystem yourself. So these ponds, they exhibit a self-regulating system, and they're not only a it's not only a place where plants and animals are living, but it's also a place where plants and animals are making the ecosystem sustainable or habitable for their survival. So, and it can become clear if you, let's say, if you collect a bottle of pond water or a scoop of the water mud. So this will show you how these organisms, they are capable, even in small spaces, they're capable of carrying out a proper food web in a food chain, and both small. And so this whole system, even though it looks very simple on the outside, but it complexly manages everything within itself, and it can support life forms within itself with the help of the biotic and abiotic factors that are there. So since they are small systems, they are very they're not relatively large. They can be artificial also, and since they are small, so they fill up. They can easily fill up when the monsoons are there, or you can introduce water if they're otherwise dry. And since they are small, they're also shallow. They are not very deep. Some of them may deep, but they are not extremely deep. So since they are small systems, light is capable of penetrating completely within these pond ecosystem. So if we talk about abiotic factors, तो कौन से abiotic factors होंगे? Temperature, these are small systems wherein water can be made available. So the major abiotic factors which affect these ecosystems, they're either temperature, or it may be the availability of light or the penetration of light. Mostly light is capable of penetrating these ecosystems, although the intensity of penetration, it decreases as we go down the surface. The upper portion receives higher sunlight, higher light availability, while the lower portions, they receive a little less amount of sunlight. And the biotic factors which are there, it can be in the form of floating weeds. I'm sure you must not have heard, but Anabina azola, it's किसी ने सुना है कभी?
Yes.
Okay, Sharan ne. So I ठीक है, so I'll let's not go there. So we'll simply stick to examples like blue-green algae or some ferns maybe, so or some blue green algae, so some weeds, some ferns, some algae may survive there. Then it can also have rooted vegetation. It can also have water hyacinths growing. Animals like or the faunal organisms like fishes, frogs, snails, worms, they can also be there. And the abiotic factors affecting the growth of these organisms can be in the form of temperature and light. So because of temperature, because of especially because of penetration of light, temperature is also affected, and this forms three major thermal zones within the static ecosystem. So they are standing ecosystems. They are systems where water is not flowing. It's stagnant and it's still. So water can be divided into three major zones, which we'll be studying. They're majorly hypolimnion, epilimnion, and mesolimnion. So we'll be studying these three zones. Similarly, in case of lake ecosystems, which are giant, they are much more, and since they are bigger, they are a sort of permanent ponds. They do not dry up that easily. कि थोड़ी rainfall में they'll end up drying because they are bigger in size. They are deeper than the ponds. They do not dry up very easy, and they're often filled with water throughout the year compared to pond ecosystem जहाँ पे if there are dry conditions or if monsoon is not very frequent or it comes late maybe, then they end up drying, or if there are warmer conditions, then they dry. So these lakes are often fed by rivers. They are drains which end up into where from which water are collected into these lake systems. And since they are deeper, light does not penetrate completely. And since light does not penetrate completely, there is a zone in these ecosystems. So as I said, there are four zones. So there are four zones because there is a zone जहाँ पे light is not capable of reaching, and that is the portion जहाँ पर which is completely dark and is the lowest portion of the ecosystem. So lake ecosystem, since they are deeper, they have much higher depth compared to pond ecosystem. So इनमें चार zones होते हैं as compared to pond ecosystem, which has three thermal zones. So we'll be studying what zones are there. We'll be studying, and thermal stratification, as I said, is these zones are divided. They have been formed based upon the different organisms that are there or the depth of the ecosystem. Then they can be categorized also based on temperature difference, which is your thermal stratification. They can also be differentiated based upon light zones, whether penetration of light is complete or not. So let's differentiate both these systems with the primary way of differentiating them, which is because of which is on the basis of light zones. So the areas where light penetrates completely are called photic zones, of course, because photic, photosynthesis. So in case of lake ecosystem, as I said, in pond ecosystem, light penetrates completely. So there is a photic zone. But in case of lake ecosystem, the light is not able to penetrate completely down the surface, and that is why the areas where light is available in abundance are the photic zone, while the areas where is not capable of penetrating the whole surface, they are called as aphotic zones. Similarly, these are the light zones. Similarly, they can be also differentiated based upon temperature. Based on temperature, they can be differentiated into epilimnion, thermocline, and hypolimnion or meta. So thermocline is also called as meta or mesolimnion. So these are the two other names of thermocline. So epilimnion, epi matlab the uppermost region, and limnion. So the uppermost region is the area जहाँ पे temperature is as high as 30 degrees. It has warmer temperature. Similarly, hypolimnion, since it's the deeper portion, it has a little colder temperature. It goes down to between 10 to 12 degrees or 15 degrees. And similarly, there's a zone in between them, जहाँ पे mixing occurs, which is between epi and hypolimnion, wherein mixing of both these types of water is there. And this transition zone is known as metalimnion or thermocline. And metalimnion or thermocline has a temperature of about 20 degrees or 18 to 20 degrees. So it has a temperature which lies in the middle. So we can categorize them into light on the basis of light availability into photic and photic zones. We can also differentiate them between based on temperature of the zones into epilimnion, thermocline, and hypolimnion. And we can also categorize them on the basis of the depth of the water system and also the type of organisms that are there. So littoral zone is the zone जहाँ पे there is part soil and part river or part soil or part pond or lake available. So it is the area जहाँ पे the water body is in association, it is in constant contact with the terrestrial part. So it often includes weeds or floating plants or plants which are attached to the soil substrate. So it a littoral zone often is the area जहाँ पे these floating plants are present or attached plants or the plants attached to a soil substratum are there. So the area wherein so this area which includes small fishes, floating plants is your littoral zone. Similarly, as you go deeper into the lake ecosystem or the pond ecosystem, so the central area or the area wherein plants which are directly there, it does not have plants growing or attaching from the soils. You simply have a water zone. So it's the area जहाँ पे fishes are surviving. So that area is known as limnetic zone. Then we come to profundal zone, which is deeper portion of the middle deeper portion of the lake or a pond, जहाँ पे bigger fishes are present or probably worms are present, which are bigger in size. And then the fourth zone, which is not there in case of pond ecosystem, is the benthic zone. So benthic zone matlab ki the lowermost, the bottom zone. So in the bottom zone, availability of light is less, and even if it's there to a certain extent in case of pond ecosystem, often in the benthic zone, so whenever these fishes or these floating organisms or these plants, when they die, so they die and they fall off and collect in the benthic zone. So often the benthic zone has microorganisms which are capable of decomposing these organisms or dead and decaying organisms. So I'll also revise it in the next class. I'll give you there are definitions of all these zones which I'll be providing to you. But I hope it's clear to everybody jitna we studied.
Yes,
Yes.
ma'am.
ठीक है तो
Yes, ma'am.
ठीक है then we'll end it for the day. You can start leaving. I'll download your attendance from here. And कुछ समझ ना आए तो you can ask me on Monday when we have our next class.
Thank you,
And
ma'am.
Thank you,
and
ma'am.
thank you for the class today. Welcome.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
I have a little question. Can I ask?
Yes.
Why is this a pond called a freshwater ecosystem even if the water is stagnant?
ओके सो ठीक है तो फ्रेश वाटर इकोसिस्टम्स को हमने दो कैटेगरीज में जो डिवाइड करा है तो वो उसी बेसिस पे किया है कि इफ वेदर दे आर स्टैंडिंग और इफ दे आर फ्लोइंग सो as I said ki there are lentic ecosystems and lotic ecosystems. So lotic ecosystems are flowing and pond is not flowing, right? It's simply standing at a particular place. It's not flowing from one point to another, unlike rivers. And that is why it is a fresh source of water. It basically collect water and you sustain an ecosystem. So the categorization of freshwater ecosystems into lentic and lotic in the very first place is based upon the fact ki whether the water body is flowing or if it's static. So static freshwater bodies are ponds and lakes, and flowing freshwater bodies are rivers and streams.
Does this mean that the pond water is fit for drinking also?
Pond water is yes, it can be fit for drinking, but more than that, often ponds, artificial ponds, they are extensively used for purification of water. So pond ecosystems, as I said, ki there are artificial ecosystems also. So they're often not collected for drinking water. In unka economic purpose is not collecting water for drinking. But yes, pond water or pond ecosystems, since they are small ecosystems with very complex organisms surviving together, so often the water treatment plants that we see, wherein water from Yamuna River, so they are a huge energy source. So we have a small area जहाँ पे so much energetical interactions are happening. So often ecosystems, and as I said, if Sharan had heard of the example of Anabina azola or the blue-green algae that are there. So you see there are very small. If a water body is flowing, as in river water bodies, so you must never have seen that green colored algae growing on a flowing water system, because they're constantly moving, they're constantly flowing from one point to another. So there is not consistent storage of energy, unlike in case of pond ecosystems, which are also small and which can also support stagnant growth or stable growth of these producers. So often these pond ecosystems, their application in industry is in the form ki like Yamuna river water or Ganga ka river water, which is dirty, or the waste industrial water. It's, so one of the application of pond ecosystem is that the energy that it generates is often used for purification of river drinking water, because they are stable systems, so they offer higher production of these producers, and they can often be clubbed with bioreactors to generate energy, and also the high amounts of producers that are there. So if a lot of farmers, a lot of people who practice organic farming, so they often dig up, they often create these artificial pond ecosystems, and they culture plants like Anabina azola, which is a fern. So azola is a fern, and this fern has a microorganism called Anabina. And as I said, I mentioned biofertilizers earlier also, and there's blue-green algae also. So these organisms, they grow best in pond ecosystems. So the people or the farmers who probably want to carry organic farming or cannot afford chemical fertilizers, they can set up these pond ecosystems, and it's very easy to grow these algae and these ferns. And when these algae and these ferns, since they're very good sources of nitrogen, they fix nitrogen constantly. They, as I discussed in a couple of classes ago, they're good fixators of nitrogen. So these organisms can also be collected. They can be used as manures in field. They can also be used for production of biogases. So they have applications, but that application is not exactly to obtain drinking water. But it's different because these are small systems which can store high amount of energy. So they have applications like these, like purification of the drinking, the flowing water, uh, or probably their usage in organic farming, or for providing biogas, or as green manures. So these are some applications of these lentic ecosystems.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome. So I'll end.
एक्सक्यूज मैम।
Yes.
मैम जो हिंदी मीडियम में ईवीएस वाला पेपर देने वाले हैं उनके लिए क्या है? आप हिंदी में थोड़े पढ़ाओगे उनको?
नहीं, मैं ऐसे ही पढ़ाऊंगी, और मैं ट्राई कर रही हूँ कि मतलब अगर आपको कभी भी लगे कि मैं मतलब फ्लो में मतलब हिंदी में नहीं बोल रही हूँ, तो मुझे वहीं पे टोक दिया करो। आई विल स्टार्ट एक्सप्लेनिंग इन हिंदी, बट हिंदी में मैंने जो एक मटेरियल प्रोवाइड करा है,
यस
आप उसको
मैम।
रेफर कर सकते हो पढ़ने के लिए। आई ट्राई फाइंडिंग बुक्स ऑल्सो केशव, लेकिन मुझे लास्ट टाइम भी बस यही मिला था, बट आई ट्राई अगर मुझे कोई और। इराक बरूचा की बुक है, मैंने इंग्लिश में तो अपलोड करी है। आई विल सी अगर वो हिंदी में मुझे मिलती है, तो और अगर नहीं मिलती है तो यू कैन बाय दैट बुक। सो इराक बरूचा की बुक इज द वन विच इज ऑफन रेफर्ड बाय स्टूडेंट्स जो हिंदी में पेपर देते हैं।
ओके मैम।
ठीक है, बाकी आई ट्राई, देन यू कैन
हाँ मैम।
आस्क मुझे बिल्कुल
यस मैम,
बोल।
कोई एक टेक्निकल वर्ड होता है ना, वो उनमें थोड़े रहते हैं कि इंग्लिश में वो क्या बोलते हैं और हिंदी में क्या बोलते हैं, इसलिए।
अच्छा,